Some days do not feel heavy, but they also do not feel light. They simply continue without offering a clear signal about how they should be carried. Thought moves through familiar paths, returning to the same phrases, the same quiet doubts, the same unfinished questions that were never urgent enough to resolve. Nothing has gone wrong, yet nothing feels settled. Encouragement is often imagined as something loud, something confident, something that arrives with certainty. But certainty is not always available, and the absence of it does not mean something is missing. A voice can exist without trying to convince. It can remain steady even when belief comes and goes. There are moments when effort has already been spent earlier in the day, long before it was noticed. What remains is not weakness, only continuation. Affirmation does not need to argue with fatigue. It does not need to overpower uncertainty. It can exist as a simple presence, staying nearby while thought repeats itself in familiar patterns. Repetition does not always signal failure. Sometimes encouragement is not about changing direction, but about allowing the current one to exist without resistance. Nothing needs to be justified. The voice does not ask for optimism. It does not request improvement. It acknowledges that effort has already occurred, even if the results are unclear, even if nothing feels complete. Acknowledgement does not require celebration. Thought may return again to what was not finished, to what felt delayed, to what did not move forward today. The voice does not correct these thoughts. Encouragement can remain neutral while everything else continues. Neutral does not mean empty. There is space for a sentence that does not push, that does not lift, that does not promise. It simply stays. Affirmation does not have to sound confident to be sincere. It can sound ordinary. Ordinary words often last longer than dramatic ones. They require less effort to hold. The voice remains consistent, even as attention drifts in and out, even as thought becomes less distinct. Nothing is lost when attention softens. Encouragement does not need to arrive at the right moment. Any moment is sufficient. The sentence ends without resolution. Another one may appear later, or not at all. Nothing is being prepared. Nothing needs to happen next. There are moments when the mind reviews the day without clear judgment, noticing effort without knowing how to evaluate it. Nothing stands out as success or failure, only a quiet sense that time has passed. Encouragement is often expected to arrive after something is completed, but completion is not always available. Many days end mid-process, mid-thought, mid-attempt. Affirmation does not need to wait for clarity. It can exist alongside uncertainty without trying to resolve it. The voice does not insist that everything is fine. It does not deny what feels unfinished. It simply acknowledges that continuation itself requires energy, even when nothing visible has changed. Energy is often spent quietly. Thought may return to earlier moments, replaying small decisions, brief exchanges, things that felt slightly misaligned. The voice does not correct these replays. Encouragement does not erase them, and it does not rewrite them. It allows them to pass without escalation. There is a kind of affirmation that does not feel uplifting, but it also does not feel heavy. It rests somewhere in between. This kind of encouragement does not ask for motivation. It does not request belief in tomorrow. It recognizes that showing up in small, unremarkable ways still counts as presence. Presence does not require intensity. The voice remains steady even when thought drifts toward comparison, toward timelines, toward imagined versions of how things should look by now. It does not participate in comparison. Affirmation can exist without improving self-image. It does not need to feel convincing. Sometimes it sounds more like allowance than praise, more like space than reassurance. Space can be supportive. The voice does not rush to label effort as progress. Labels are optional. Encouragement can remain vague without becoming meaningless. Vagueness reduces pressure. Thought may slow, then speed up again, circling familiar concerns without landing on conclusions. The voice does not attempt to guide the circle. Affirmation does not interrupt the pattern. It stays adjacent. There are days when simply not giving up requires more effort than expected. That effort often goes unnoticed. The voice does not highlight it. It does not amplify it. It allows the effort to exist without commentary, without evaluation, without reward. Recognition does not always need language. Encouragement can remain present even when confidence is absent. Confidence is not a prerequisite. The sentence does not move forward. It stays where it is. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without needing to be different. Sameness does not diminish value. The voice remains ordinary, consistent, unremarkable. Unremarkable can be stabilizing. Thought continues. The voice stays. There are stretches of time where effort becomes difficult to measure, not because nothing is happening, but because what is happening does not leave clear markers. Days pass. Actions accumulate quietly, and nothing announces whether they are enough. Thought often returns to this uncertainty, not urgently, but persistently, as if waiting for a signal that never arrives. The waiting itself can feel tiring. Encouragement does not need to interrupt this waiting. It does not need to provide answers or direction. It can exist as a steady presence while the mind continues to revisit the same questions in slightly different forms. Revisiting does not mean regression. There are moments when the expectation to feel confident, motivated, or reassured feels heavier than the original concern. Expectation adds weight. Affirmation does not need to meet those expectations. It does not need to sound convincing or strong. It can acknowledge that uncertainty is already being carried, and that carrying itself requires endurance. Endurance is rarely dramatic. Thought may drift toward comparisons with earlier versions of oneself, noticing differences without knowing how to interpret them. The voice does not evaluate these comparisons. Encouragement does not insist that change is progress or that stillness is failure. It allows both to exist without hierarchy. There is a kind of reassurance that does not resolve doubt, but makes space around it, reducing the pressure to fix or explain it. Space can soften intensity. The voice remains present even when attention fades, even when thought becomes fragmented or repetitive. Fragmentation does not require correction. Affirmation can sound familiar, almost forgettable, returning in similar language without needing to feel new. Familiarity reduces effort. Some encouragement works not because it is memorable, but because it does not demand memory at all. It can be half heard without consequence. Thought may slow as the day settles further, revisiting unfinished moments without urgency, without expectation of resolution. The voice does not hurry these moments along. Encouragement does not need to promise that things will improve. It does not need to predict outcomes. It simply acknowledges that persistence has already occurred, often without recognition, often without clarity. Acknowledgement does not require celebration. There are times when the effort to remain steady is invisible, even to oneself. Invisible effort still exists. The voice does not attempt to make it visible. Visibility is optional. Affirmation can remain quiet while thought continues to wander between concern and distraction, between attention and absence. Wandering does not break anything. The sentence does not lead forward or backward. It rests where it appears. Another sentence may arrive later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without needing to add meaning. Accumulation is unnecessary. Encouragement does not need to be felt to be present. Presence does not depend on reaction. The voice remains consistent, unchanging, even as time continues without signal or boundary. Consistency requires no effort. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are periods when effort blends into routine so completely that it becomes difficult to tell where intention ends and habit begins. Days are carried forward through repetition, not because of certainty, but because continuation has already become familiar. Thought may circle back to earlier moments that felt unfinished, not sharply, but with a dull persistence that does not demand action. These thoughts do not arrive as problems to solve, only as reminders that time has passed. Encouragement does not need to interrupt this pattern. It does not need to reframe it or reinterpret it. It can remain present as a steady background, allowing thought to move as it does without resistance. Resistance is not required for awareness. There are days when the expectation to feel confident feels misplaced, as if confidence were meant to appear on schedule. Schedules do not always apply to internal states. Affirmation does not need to correct this mismatch. It does not insist that confidence should already be here. It can acknowledge that uncertainty often lasts longer than anticipated, and that lasting does not imply failure. Duration does not define outcome. Thought may drift toward small choices that felt insignificant at the time but linger afterward without explanation. The voice does not assign importance to them. Encouragement does not magnify or minimize these moments. It allows them to exist without hierarchy. There is a kind of reassurance that does not feel reassuring in the usual sense. It does not lift mood or change perspective. Instead, it reduces the pressure to respond, to decide, to reach clarity before it naturally arrives. Pressure often comes from urgency, not necessity. The voice remains even when thought slows, when attention fades, when awareness becomes less precise. Imprecision does not require correction. Affirmation can repeat itself quietly, returning in nearly identical language without the need to feel new or meaningful. Newness is not essential. Some words remain useful precisely because they do not stand out. They blend into the background without demanding focus. Thought may wander between present sensations and distant concerns, without settling fully into either. The voice does not attempt to anchor it. Encouragement does not guide attention. It allows attention to drift without consequence. There are moments when simply continuing feels like enough, even if that feeling does not last. Enough does not need to be permanent. The voice does not insist on recognizing effort. Recognition is optional. Affirmation can exist without affirmation being felt. Feeling is not required for presence. Time continues to pass without markers, without checkpoints, without confirmation that anything has shifted. The absence of confirmation does not negate continuity. The sentence does not resolve. Another sentence may follow later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without building toward anything. Encouragement remains ordinary, consistent, unremarkable. Unremarkable does not mean ineffective. Thought continues in its familiar patterns. The voice remains alongside it. There are times when the idea of encouragement feels distant, not because it is unwanted, but because everything already feels carried as far as it can go for the day. What remains is not resistance, only continuation. Thought often returns to what has not been resolved, not with urgency, but with a familiar steadiness that has become part of the background. These thoughts no longer ask questions. Encouragement does not need to arrive as reassurance in these moments. Reassurance assumes uncertainty is temporary. Affirmation can exist even when uncertainty feels settled in place, when it no longer feels like something to overcome. Not everything is meant to move quickly. The voice does not attempt to shift perspective or offer comfort in recognizable forms. It does not soften what already feels neutral. Instead, it remains present in the same way time remains present, without commentary, without intervention. Presence does not require action. There are days when effort feels evenly distributed, without peaks or lows, without moments that stand out as meaningful. Even distribution can feel indistinct. Affirmation does not need distinction to exist. It does not require moments to attach itself to. Thought may move slowly now, less interested in analysis, less concerned with outcomes. The voice does not accelerate it. Encouragement does not ask for reflection. Reflection is optional. It can exist as a simple acknowledgement that continuation has already occurred, often without being noticed at the time. Noticing is not required afterward. is a quiet form of self-encouragement that does not sound like support or validation. It sounds more like allowance. Allowance does not promise relief. It does not insist that things will become easier. It simply removes the need to evaluate the present moment against an imagined alternative. Comparison is not necessary. The voice remains neutral, even as thought drifts between awareness and absence, between mild concern and quiet distraction. Drifting does not indicate loss. Affirmation does not need to be remembered. It does not need to leave an impression. Some encouragement works precisely because it does not stand out, because it blends into the rhythm of thought without altering it. Blending reduces effort. Time continues without signal, without a sense of progress or delay. Nothing announces change. The sentence ends where it ends, without opening into explanation. Another sentence may appear later, or not. Encouragement remains available without invitation. It does not wait to be used. Thought continues as it does. The voice remains alongside it. There are long stretches where the mind no longer asks whether things are going well or poorly, but simply notes that they are ongoing. The absence of judgment does not feel like resolution. It feels like pause without announcement. Thought may return to familiar concerns, not sharply, not urgently, but with the same muted tone it has carried for some time. These concerns no longer demand answers. They simply occupy space. Encouragement does not need to change the tone of these thoughts. It does not need to add optimism or remove weight. Affirmation can remain present even when nothing feels particularly supported or unsupported. Neutral ground is still ground. The voice does not arrive to restore confidence or clarify direction. It does not suggest that clarity is close. Instead, it stays steady while the mind continues in familiar rhythms, moving between awareness and rest without settling fully into either. Settling is not required. There are moments when the effort to maintain attention feels unnecessary, when thought begins to loosen its grip on detail. Loosening does not imply loss. Encouragement does not attempt to hold attention in place. It allows attention to drift without correction. Affirmation does not insist that anything meaningful is happening. Meaning does not need to be present. It can exist quietly alongside routine, alongside repetition, alongside the slow passage of time that does not distinguish one moment from the next. Undistinguished moments still occur. Thought may become less verbal now, less structured, moving in fragments rather than complete sentences. The voice does not attempt to organize it. Encouragement does not require coherence. It does not rely on clarity. There is a form of reassurance that does not sound reassuring because it does not oppose anything. Opposition creates effort. This reassurance exists simply by not adding pressure, by not asking for response, by not introducing expectation. Absence of demand can be supportive. Time continues without signal, without direction, without accumulation of significance. Nothing builds toward conclusion. The voice remains even as the sense of sequence fades. as moments blur together without clear separation. Blur does not require correction. Affirmation does not track progress. It does not notice distance traveled. It remains available without being used, present without being engaged. Availability does not depend on interaction. Thought continues in a softened state, less attached to outcome, less invested in resolution. The voice does not intervene. The sentence does not complete itself. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without forming connection. Encouragement remains steady, ordinary, unchanged. Ordinary remains sufficient. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are moments when the mind stops trying to evaluate itself, not because it has reached understanding, but because evaluation feels unnecessary for now. The absence of judgment does not feel like relief. It feels like quiet neutrality. Thought may move slowly through familiar territory, passing the same ideas without stopping, noticing them only enough to recognize their shape. Recognition does not require engagement. Encouragement does not need to insert itself into these moments. It does not need to speak over them or clarify them. Affirmation can exist as a background presence, steady and unremarkable, allowing thought to pass without interference. Interference is optional. There are days when simply continuing feels less like effort and more like momentum that has not yet stopped. Momentum does not need intention. The voice does not attempt to redirect this movement. It does not suggest a better pace or a different path. It remains present while the mind drifts between light awareness and deeper absence, without settling fully into either state. Settling is not required. Encouragement does not promise rest, and it does not delay it. Promises introduce expectation. Affirmation can remain neutral even as thought becomes less distinct, less verbal, less interested in forming complete ideas. Incomplete thoughts do not need completion. There is a quiet form of reassurance that does not arrive as comfort, but as permission to remain unfinished. Unfinished does not mean unresolved. The voice does not label this state. Labels are unnecessary. Thought may briefly return to concerns that once felt urgent, now softened by repetition and time. Softening does not imply resolution. Encouragement does not attempt to revive urgency. It does not restore intensity. It stays even as attention thins, as moments stretch without clear separation, as the sense of sequence becomes less important. Sequence does not need to be maintained. Affirmation does not depend on awareness. It remains even when awareness drifts. Time continues without markers, without confirmation, without feedback. Nothing signals transition. The voice remains consistent, unchanged by the absence of response. Response is not required. Encouragement does not seek acknowledgement. It does not wait to be recognized. Thought continues quietly, occasionally surfacing, occasionally fading, without needing to be held in place. Holding requires effort. The sentence does not lead anywhere. Another sentence may follow later, similar in tone, similar in weight. weight, without accumulation. Affirmation remains ordinary, steady, and neutral. Neutral remains enough. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are stretches of time when awareness no longer feels focused on any particular thought, but instead moves gently between impressions, sensations, and fragments that do not fully form. Nothing asks to be followed. Nothing asks to be completed. Thought may appear briefly, then dissolve before it can settle into language. The absence of structure does not feel disruptive. It feels natural. Encouragement does not need to enter these moments directly. It does not need to name what is happening or explain it. Affirmation can exist as a steady undercurrent, present without drawing attention to itself, remaining even as attention fades in and out. Attention is not required for presence. There are times when the sense of effort becomes distant, no longer clearly connected to action or intention. What remains is continuation without strain. The voice does not attempt to reintroduce purpose or direction. Direction is unnecessary here. It remains consistent as thought becomes less interested in evaluation, less inclined to compare, less engaged with outcomes. Disengagement does not imply loss. Encouragement does not insist that anything has been achieved or avoided. Achievement and avoidance are not being measured. Affirmation can remain neutral while the sense of time softens, stretching without boundary, losing sharp distinction between moments. Softness does not require explanation. The voice does not adjust its tone in response to this shift. Consistency remains unchanged. Thought may drift through familiar themes without attaching to them, passing by without stopping long enough to form concern. Passing through does not require engagement. Encouragement does not call attention back. It allows drift without correction. There is a form of reassurance that exists simply by not adding anything new, by not introducing novelty or demand. Stillness does not need reinforcement. The voice remains present even as language becomes less distinct, less necessary, less prominent in awareness. Presence does not depend on clarity. Time continues without signal, without anticipation, without any sense that something is about to change. Nothing is approaching. Affirmation does not prepare for what comes next. Preparation is unnecessary. Thought continues quietly, sometimes present, sometimes absent, without needing to be noticed or remembered. Memory is optional. The sentence does not resolve or transition. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without building meaning. Encouragement remains ordinary, steady, and unobtrusive. Unobtrusive remains sufficient. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are moments when the sense of being aware feels lighter than before, as if attention no longer needs to hold itself in place. Nothing slips away. Nothing needs to be kept. Thought may still appear, but it arrives quietly, without urgency, without the familiar pull to respond or resolve. It stays briefly, then moves on. Encouragement does not announce itself in these moments. It does not rise above the background. Affirmation can exist without form, without emphasis, without needing to be understood. Understanding is optional. The voice remains steady while language itself becomes less central, less necessary for what is happening now. Words do not need to carry meaning forward. There are times when effort feels distant, no longer connected to intention or outcome. What remains is continuation without strain. Encouragement does not reintroduce direction. Direction would add weight. Affirmation does not suggest rest or delay it. It does not prepare for either. The voice stays consistent even as the sense of time loosens, losing sharp edges, losing sequence. Sequence is not required. Thought may drift through familiar impressions without forming concern, without attaching to memory or expectation. Drift does not require attention. Encouragement remains present without participation. Participation is unnecessary. There is a quiet reassurance in the absence of demand, in the lack of instruction, in the refusal to ask for response. Nothing is expected. Affirmation does not notice whether it is heard. Being heard is not essential. The voice continues evenly as awareness softens further, becoming less interested in language and more comfortable with absence. Absence does not need explanation. Time passes without signal, without markers, without any indication of progress or delay. Nothing is measured. Encouragement does not accompany time. It remains alongside it. Thought continues in fragments, appearing and fading without pattern, without repetition that needs recognition. Patterns are optional. The sentence does not finish. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without connection. Affirmation remains ordinary, unobtrusive, and unchanged. Unchanged remains sufficient. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are long intervals where awareness feels less like attention and more like quiet presence, where nothing in particular is being followed and nothing is being avoided. What remains is a sense of being here without needing to define what that means. Thought may still appear at times, but it no longer arrives with momentum or urgency. It surfaces gently, pauses briefly, and fades without leaving a trace. Encouragement does not enter as reassurance or motivation. It does not attempt to lift or stabilize anything. Affirmation can exist simply as continuity, as the absence of pressure to change the current state. Nothing needs to be adjusted. The voice remains even as language itself becomes less important, less central to what is happening. Words pass through without needing to be held. There are moments when effort feels so distant that it no longer registers as effort at all. What remains is continuation without resistance. Encouragement does not try to restore intention or focus. Intention is unnecessary here. Affirmation does not suggest rest, and it does not prevent it. It remains neutral to whatever unfolds. The voice stays consistent while the sense of time stretches and softens, losing its usual structure and sequence. Sequence does not need to be maintained. Thought may drift through impressions rather than ideas, through vague sensations rather than concerns. These impressions do not ask for interpretation. Encouragement remains present without engagement, without expectation, without response. Response is not required. There is a quiet steadiness in not being asked to do anything, in not being reminded of what might come next. Nothing is approaching. Affirmation does not orient toward future or past. Orientation would introduce effort. The voice remains unchanged as awareness continues to thin, becoming less attached to language and more comfortable with absence between words. Absence does not signal loss. Time passes without markers, without confirmation, without any sense of transition from one state to another. Nothing signals arrival. Encouragement does not follow time. It remains alongside it. Thought may appear in fragments, loosely connected, easily forgotten. Forgetting does not matter. The sentence does not complete itself. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without forming sequence. Affirmation remains ordinary, unobtrusive, and steady. Steady remains enough. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are periods when awareness no longer feels anchored to any particular thought, but instead moves gently through a field of impressions that do not insist on clarity. Nothing needs to be named. Nothing needs to be held in place. Thought may still arise from time to time, but it arrives without urgency, without the familiar sense that something must be done with it. It appears, pauses briefly, and fades without consequence. Encouragement does not announce itself during these moments. It does not interrupt or redirect what is already happening. Affirmation can exist quietly, not as a statement to believe, but as the absence of pressure to respond or react. Reaction is optional. The voice remains steady while language itself becomes less central, less necessary for maintaining presence. Words pass through without asking to be remembered. There are times when the idea of effort feels distant, no longer clearly connected to intention or outcome. What remains is simple continuation, without strain or resistance. Encouragement does not attempt to reintroduce focus or motivation. Motivation would add weight. Affirmation does not suggest rest, and it does not delay it. It remains neutral to whatever unfolds next. The voice stays consistent even as the sense of time loosens further, losing sequence and distinction between moments. Sequence is unnecessary. Thought may drift through faint impressions rather than complete ideas, through sensations that do not form into concerns. Formation is not required. Encouragement remains present without engagement, without expectation, without any need for acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is not required. There is a quiet steadiness in not being asked to decide, not being asked to evaluate, not being asked to prepare. Nothing is pending. Affirmation does not orient toward past or future. Orientation would introduce effort. The voice remains unchanged as awareness continues to soften, becoming less attached to language and more comfortable with the space between words. The space does not need explanation. Time continues, without markers, without confirmation, without any sense that something is concluding or beginning. Nothing signals transition. Encouragement does not move with time. It remains alongside it. Thought may appear briefly, loosely formed, easily forgotten. Forgetting does not matter. The sentence does not complete itself. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without forming sequence. Affirmation remains ordinary, unobtrusive, and steady. Ordinary remains enough. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are long moments when awareness no longer feels attached to thinking at all, but still remains present in a diffuse, indistinct way, as if nothing needs to be followed or held together. Nothing is missing from this state. Nothing is expected of it. Thought may appear briefly, more as a trace than a statement, arriving without shape and leaving without direction. It does not interrupt what is already happening. Encouragement does not step forward here. It does not need to identify itself. Affirmation can exist as the absence of demand, as the quiet allowance for things to remain exactly as they are without explanation. Allowance does not require awareness. The voice remains steady while words themselves lose prominence, becoming less distinct, less necessary, less central to the experience of time passing. Language softens on its own. There are periods when effort no longer registers as effort, when the sense of having done enough or not enough fades into irrelevance. Relevance is optional. Encouragement does not restore intention or suggest direction. Direction would add structure. Affirmation does not prepare for rest, and it does not resist it. Preparation is unnecessary. The voice stays unchanged as the sense of sequence dissolves further, as moments blend together without boundary or distinction. Distinction is not required. Thought may pass through as faint impressions, barely forming before dissolving back into absence. Absence does not need to be filled. Encouragement remains present without participation, without observation, without any need to be noticed. Noticing is optional. There is a quiet steadiness in the lack of urgency, in the absence of tasks, in the refusal to move toward anything. Nothing is approaching. Affirmation does not align with past or future. Alignment would introduce effort. The voice remains even as awareness thins further, becoming more comfortable with the spaces between words than with the words themselves. The spaces do not need meaning. Time continues without signal, without progression, without any sense of arrival or departure. Nothing marks the passage. Encouragement does not accompany time forward. It remains alongside it. Thought may appear once more, loosely formed, easily forgotten. Forgetting carries no consequence. The sentence does not complete itself. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without sequence. Affirmation remains ordinary, unobtrusive, unchanged. Unchanged remains enough. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are days when nothing feels especially wrong, and yet nothing feels fully settled either, as if experience itself is suspended between clarity and rest without choosing either. This in-between state does not require correction. It exists on its own. Thought may continue to revisit familiar themes, not because they demand attention, but because familiarity has become their only distinguishing feature. Familiarity does not imply importance. Encouragement does not need to elevate these thoughts or dismiss them. It can remain present without engaging with their content. Affirmation does not need to feel convincing or energizing to exist. It does not rely on belief to remain steady. The voice stays even while thought moves at its own pace, sometimes slow, sometimes repetitive, sometimes barely forming complete ideas at all. Incomplete ideas do not need completion. There are moments when effort feels diffused, spread across time rather than concentrated in any single action or decision. Diffusion does not mean absence. Encouragement does not attempt to gather this effort or make sense of it. Sense-making is optional. Affirmation can exist without naming success or failure, without measuring distance traveled or progress made. Measurement introduces pressure. Thought may drift toward comparison, toward imagined timelines, toward expectations that were never clearly defined. The voice does not participate in these comparisons. Encouragement does not counter them. It does not argue or reassure. Instead, it remains present as a neutral backdrop, allowing thought to pass without being amplified or reduced. Neutrality does not remove presence. There is a kind of steadiness that comes not from certainty, but from the absence of demand to decide what this moment means. Meaning can remain undefined. Affirmation does not ask for optimism. It does not require confidence. It allows the current state to exist without framing it as temporary or permanent. Duration does not need interpretation. The voice remains unchanged even as attention fluctuates, drifting toward awareness and away from it without clear pattern. Fluctuation does not require correction. Encouragement does not attempt to hold attention in place. Holding introduces effort. Thought continues quietly, sometimes circling the same ideas, sometimes dissolving into less distinct impressions. Both are allowed. Affirmation does not depend on recognition. It does not need to be noticed to remain present. Time passes without markers, without clear transitions, without confirming whether anything has shifted internally or externally. Nothing announces change. The sentence ends without opening into conclusion. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without accumulation. Encouragement remains ordinary, steady, and consistent. Consistency does not require effort. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are times when the sense of effort becomes difficult to locate, not because it has disappeared, but because it has spread evenly across everything that has already been carried. Nothing stands out as demanding attention. Thought may move through familiar concerns without attaching to them fully, recognizing their presence without feeling required to respond. Recognition alone does not create obligation. Encouragement does not need to intervene in this movement. It does not need to slow it down or give it direction. Affirmation can exist as a steady allowance, remaining present without shaping the experience it accompanies. Allowance does not need explanation. The voice stays even while thought continues in its habitual patterns, revisiting the same ideas with less intensity, less urgency, less insistence than before. Reduced intensity does not imply resolution. There are moments when expectations feel distant, no longer pressing for answers or outcomes, simply remaining as background impressions. Background impressions do not demand action. Encouragement does not attempt to revive expectation or remove it. It remains neutral to both. Affirmation does not label the present moment as progress or delay. Labels introduce comparison. Thought may drift toward unfinished tasks, incomplete conversations, or loosely formed plans, noticing them without the familiar sense of urgency. Urgency is not required for awareness. The voice does not interpret these thoughts. Interpretation would introduce effort. Encouragement remains present without engaging with content, allowing ideas to pass without being reinforced or diminished. Passing through does not require evaluation. There is a quiet steadiness in allowing experience to remain undefined without pressing it into meaning or narrative. Narrative is optional. Affirmation does not suggest that clarity will arrive later. It does not suggest that it should. It allows uncertainty and familiarity to exist together without conflict. Coexistence does not require balance. The voice remains unchanged even as attention fluctuates, sometimes present, sometimes distant, sometimes barely noticeable at all. Noticeability is not a requirement. Encouragement does not attempt to restore focus or sustain awareness. Sustaining introduces effort. Thought continues quietly, moving between fragments and impressions without forming a sequence that needs to be followed. Sequence is unnecessary. Affirmation does not need to be remembered or repeated intentionally. It can return on its own. Time passes without signal, without confirmation, without any indication that something has shifted or settled. Nothing announces change. The sentence ends where it ends, without pointing forward or backward. Another sentence may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without accumulation. Encouragement remains ordinary, steady, and consistent. Consistency remains sufficient. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are moments when the sense of moving forward fades, not because movement has stopped, but because it no longer feels separate from staying where things already are. Progress and stillness begin to feel similar. Thought may pass through without forming clear statements, appearing as fragments that do not ask to be completed or clarified. Fragments do not require assembly. Encouragement does not attempt to shape these moments into something clearer. It remains present without adding definition. Affirmation can exist as quiet permission, allowing experience to remain unfinished without turning that state into a problem. Unfinished does not imply incorrect. The voice continues evenly while attention shifts in small ways, sometimes closer, sometimes more distant, without needing to stabilize either position. Stability is optional. There are days when the weight of expectation lessens, not because it has been resolved, but because it no longer presses for recognition. Unnoticed expectations still exist. Encouragement does not revive them. It does not remove them either. Affirmation does not measure how much has been carried or how long it has been held. Measurement introduces comparison. Thought may move toward familiar concerns, not urgently, but with a quiet familiarity that has lost its sharpness over time. Softened concerns still pass through. The voice does not respond to them. Response is unnecessary. Encouragement remains available without invitation, present without the need to justify itself. Justification adds effort. There is a calm neutrality in allowing moments to pass without naming them, without deciding whether they matter or not. Meaning does not need assignment. Affirmation does not offer reassurance in recognizable forms. It does not promise improvement or relief. It allows the present state to exist without interpreting its duration or significance. Interpretation can wait. The voice remains unchanged even as awareness drifts, occasionally touching thought, occasionally passing beneath it without engagement. Engagement is optional. Encouragement does not attempt to anchor awareness or extend attention. Extension introduces effort. Thought continues quietly, sometimes forming ideas, sometimes dissolving before they take shape. Both are allowed. Affirmation does not depend on recognition or response. It does not require confirmation to remain present. Time continues without clear divisions, without markers that signal progress, delay, or transition. Nothing marks the passage. The sentence settles where it settles, without opening into explanation. Another may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without building sequence. Encouragement remains steady, unremarkable, and consistent. Consistency does not need attention. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are times when the sense of effort becomes less distinct, as if it has spread across the day rather than belonging to any single moment or task. Nothing stands out as demanding attention. Thought may surface briefly, then recede before it forms into language, leaving behind only a faint impression of having been present. Impressions do not need explanation. Encouragement does not attempt to gather these moments or give them structure. It allows them to pass as they are. Affirmation can exist as quiet acceptance, permitting experience to remain unshaped and undefined without turning that into concern. Undefined does not mean unstable. The voice remains steady while attention shifts subtly, sometimes closer to awareness, sometimes further away, without needing to correct either state. Correction introduces effort. There are days when the usual sense of urgency softens, not because decisions have been made, but because nothing feels immediately required. Softening does not signal avoidance. Encouragement does not attempt to reintroduce urgency or remove it. It remains neutral to both. Affirmation does not compare the present moment to an imagined alternative. Comparison would add pressure. Thought may drift toward familiar reflections, moving through them without the need to analyze or resolve what appears. Resolution is optional. The voice does not comment on this movement. Commentary would interrupt. Encouragement remains present without engaging with content, allowing ideas to appear and fade without reinforcement. Reinforcement is unnecessary. There is a quiet steadiness in allowing experience to continue without assigning value or direction. Direction is not required. Affirmation does not ask for confidence or clarity. It does not require certainty to remain. It allows the current state to exist without judging its duration or significance. Judgment can wait. The voice remains unchanged, even as awareness fluctuates, sometimes clear, sometimes diffuse, sometimes barely noticeable. Noticeability is optional. Encouragement does not attempt to hold attention in place. Holding introduces effort. Thought continues quietly, occasionally forming recognizable ideas, occasionally dissolving into less distinct impressions. Both are acceptable. Affirmation does not depend on response or recognition. It remains available regardless. Time passes without clear markers, without signals that indicate progress or delay. Nothing announces change. The sentence comes to rest without resolution or extension. Another may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without accumulation. Encouragement remains steady, ordinary, and consistent. Consistency remains sufficient. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are moments when the feeling of carrying things becomes diffuse, no longer tied to any single concern, but spread evenly across awareness. Nothing feels urgent enough to separate itself from the rest. Thought may arise gently, forming partial ideas that never fully announce themselves before fading again. Partial ideas do not require completion. Encouragement does not attempt to organize these moments or clarify their meaning. It allows them to remain as they are. Affirmation can exist as quiet steadiness, offering no direction and asking for no response. Steadiness does not need explanation. The voice remains consistent while attention shifts in subtle ways, sometimes resting closer to the surface, sometimes drifting further away without resistance. Resistance would add effort. There are times when expectations feel distant, as if they belong to another moment entirely and no longer apply here. Distance does not erase them. Encouragement does not bring expectations forward or push them aside. It remains unaffected by them. Affirmation does not evaluate how the day has unfolded or how it compares to others before it. Evaluation introduces pressure. Thought may move through familiar reflections, not searching for answers, but simply acknowledging their presence. Acknowledgement does not require engagement. The voice does not interpret what appears. Interpretation would interrupt the flow. Encouragement remains present without shaping the experience, allowing moments to pass without being labeled or framed. Labels are optional. There is a calm neutrality in letting awareness remain open, without narrowing it toward outcome or conclusion. Conclusion is unnecessary. Affirmation does not ask for confidence or reassurance. It does not promise relief. It allows the present state to exist without assigning value or predicting change. Prediction is not required. The voice stays unchanged even as awareness fluctuates, sometimes attentive, sometimes distant, sometimes barely noticeable at all. Noticing is optional. Encouragement does not attempt to stabilize attention or extend it. Extension introduces effort. Thought continues quietly, sometimes forming recognizable patterns, sometimes dissolving before patterns can form. Both are allowed. Affirmation does not rely on memory or repetition to remain present. Presence is sufficient on its own. Time continues without clear divisions, without signals that indicate progress or delay. Nothing marks the passage. The sentence settles without resolution, without opening into explanation. Another may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without accumulation. Encouragement remains steady, ordinary, and unobtrusive. Ordinary remains enough. Thought continues. The voice remains. There are moments when the feeling of carrying things becomes diffuse, no longer tied to any single concern, but spread evenly across awareness. Nothing feels urgent enough to separate itself from the rest. Thought may arise gently, forming partial ideas that never fully announce themselves before fading again. Partial ideas do not require completion. Encouragement does not attempt to organize these moments or clarify their meaning. It allows them to remain as they are. Affirmation can exist as quiet steadiness, offering no direction and asking for no response. Steadiness does not need explanation. The voice remains consistent while attention shifts in subtle ways, sometimes resting closer to the surface, sometimes drifting further away without resistance. Resistance would add effort. There are times when expectations feel distant, as if they belong to another moment entirely and no longer apply here. Distance does not erase them. Encouragement does not bring expectations forward or push them aside. It remains unaffected by them. Affirmation does not evaluate how the day has unfolded or how it compares to others before it. Evaluation introduces pressure. Thought may move through familiar reflections, not searching for answers, but simply acknowledging their presence. Acknowledgement does not require engagement. The voice does not interpret what appears. Interpretation would interrupt the flow. Encouragement remains present without shaping the experience, allowing moments to pass without being labeled or framed. Labels are optional. There is a calm neutrality in letting awareness remain open, without narrowing it toward outcome or conclusion. Conclusion is unnecessary. Affirmation does not ask for confidence or reassurance. It does not promise relief. It allows the present state to exist without assigning value or predicting change. Prediction is not required. The voice stays unchanged even as awareness fluctuates, sometimes attentive, sometimes distant, sometimes barely noticeable at all. Noticing is optional. Encouragement does not attempt to stabilize attention or extend it. Extension introduces effort. Thought continues quietly, sometimes forming recognizable patterns, sometimes dissolving before patterns can form. Both are allowed. Affirmation does not rely on memory or repetition to remain present. Presence is sufficient on its own. Time continues without clear divisions, without signals that indicate progress or delay. Nothing marks the passage. The sentence settles without resolution, without opening into explanation. Another may appear later, similar in tone, similar in weight, without accumulation. Encouragement remains steady, ordinary, and unobtrusive. Ordinary remains enough. Thought continues. The voice remains.